Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So last week we spoke about Siam Lee, and if you haven't seen that video, I highly recommend, and as usual I'll put it somewhere up here. So if you have been following my channel for a little while, you would have known that I spoke about South Africa's first documented serial killer, but today I'm going to talk about South Africa's first documented female serial killer, and her name is Daisy Melker. So if you would like to hear about Daisy Melker and how she got her infamous title, then let's get into it.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Daisy Louisa Hancorn Smith was born in 1886 in Grahamstown, South Africa. Daisy was one of 11 children, and when Daisy was 8 years old, 2 of her brothers and her dad went to Rhodesia, which we know now as Zimbabwe. But basically her father and her brothers left because they were promised a piece of land there in Rhodesia that they could use to farm, and it was basically very cheap for them to have this piece of land, so they were very keen to go up and get it. And back in South Africa around 1886, there was quite a civil war kind of brewing already. So Daisy and a couple of other families were also going to Rhodesia, so she kind of just hopped along and went with them to join her father and her 2 brothers. So during this time, Daisy was around 10 years old, so this was 2 years after her brothers and father left. There were reports that Daisy's mother had kind of abandoned the family and went to marry another man, and shortly after she met that man and married him, she passed away. So I'm not sure which of the factors were actually true, but regardless, she went to Rhodesia to be with her 2 brothers and her father. And remember, she was only 10 years old at the time, so she left with the other families, and it was most likely by ox wagon, and it was round about a 2,000 kilometer trip to Rhodesia at the time, and that was a long way for a 10-year-old child to be with people that she didn't even know in such like a confined space. But regardless, Daisy did end up moving safely to Rhodesia and to be with her brothers and father, and she did end up going to a farm school there, and then later on 2 of her sisters did end up joining her as well. But when Daisy was 13, she left Rhodesia and moved back to South Africa, and specifically Cape Town, to go into boarding school, and she stayed there until she was 17 years old. And then in 1903, Daisy returned to Rhodesia to be with her family for quite a while, and then she left Rhodesia again to go to Durban to study to be a nurse. And obviously when you're a nurse, you learn different types of medications and where and what they can do to the body. But while Daisy was studying, she was moving back and forth between Rhodesia and Durban, and she inevitably ended up meeting a man, and his name was Bert Fuller. And this man actually ended up changing Daisy's life. But Bert, I think, was just a few years older than Daisy, and he worked at the government at the time. And by witness accounts and people who knew Bert and Daisy, they believed that they were really, really in love. And of course, they ended up getting engaged. But sadly, Bert and Daisy never got married. He actually ended up dying very soon before the wedding. And Daisy was obviously there next to him, being a nurse by his deathbed, comforting him, I guess. Back then, people believed that Bert died from a very rare autoimmune disease. I'm no doctor, so how I'm going to try and explain this is as simply as I understand it. But basically, when you take malaria immunization, you assume that you are now immune from malaria. But what Bert did is he took the malaria immunization injection or whatever it was back then, but then afterwards he got bitten by a malaria carrying mosquito. And then what happened was, because he had been immunized and now he actually had malaria in his system, what happened was his body now didn't know what to do with these cells, and instead of attacking the malaria infection, basically it kind of turned on him and started attacking his healthy cells and basically killed him from the inside. So that's how I understand it, so I hope you kind of got it. But obviously Daisy was very, very upset. But she did benefit from this financially, because just before Bert and Daisy got married, he did sign a life insurance policy, and he did make Daisy the beneficiary. And he only had a life insurance policy for around £100 back then, which nowadays is around 100,000 South African rand. But now imagine that amount of money back then. So Daisy, I assume, was heartbroken for at least a little bit, and she did stay single for a couple of months, and then she moved to Johannesburg, and this may have been for nursing work, I'm not sure, but she moved to Joburg, and then she met another man, and he was a plumber at the time, and his name was William Cowell. and he was 14 years older. And William was a wealthy man in Joburg, and he was in a city that was booming at the time. Remember, Joburg was famous for their gold, and if you ever watched Nicole, you know what I'm talking about. And around 18 months after Daisy and William met, they got married, and they would end up living quite happily for many years, and they had 5 children together. We got to remember that in the 1900s, the medicine that we have today is not the same as it was back then at all. There was no, I'm assuming, prenatal care, postnatal care, or anything like that. Child mortality was not uncommon back in the day, sadly. So just remember that when I'm going to go through the list of her children. So Daisy's first pregnancy was twins. And imagine giving birth to twins now, first of all, but imagine it back then as well. And there was no record of what they passed away from, but both the twins did not survive into infanthood or even to be children. So they lived a very, very short amount of time. So in 1911, after the twins passed, she gave birth to a son, and his name was Rhodes Cecil. But apparently this was her favorite child. After she gave birth to Rhodes, she did end up getting pregnant again, and she gave birth to another boy named Lester. And sadly, he didn't make it to 4 years of age either, and he ended up passing away. And when the neighbors asked what happened to Lester, she said that he had an incurable abscess on his stomach. The last child was also a boy, and his name was Alfred. And neighbors said that he looked perfectly healthy, and unfortunately he passed away at 15 months old. And they said that, like I said, he looked pretty healthy, and then all of a sudden he started having seizures. And then Daisy took Alfred up to the room to make him rest and stuff, and then all of a sudden he didn't make it through the night. Now, at this time, people did say that Daisy started looking very, very depressed, very disheveled, and they started to see that Daisy had signs of mental illness. But to be fair to Daisy, I don't know if they realized that you could have postnatal depression and all of that back then. So maybe she was experiencing some of that. And also she just lost 4 children. But after Daisy lost her 4th child, Alfred, it was said that she received so much sympathy from her neighbors, and the whole community came in to just give her the affection and kind of attention that she needed and see if she needed help with anything. So there was a lot of that after she lost her last child. And to be fair, she lost a fiance and 4 children, all before the age of 30. So Daisy and William didn't have any more children. Instead, they spent all of their time and finances on Rhodes and spoiling him. And they did end up moving to Germiston, where they stayed for quite a while, and they seemed pretty happy until 1923. And remember, I briefly said that William was a plumber. And obviously, when you're in a plumber and you're in that kind of physical labor all day, you get your aches and pains. William obviously had that as well. And Daisy, being a nurse, she would look after him, and she would give him Epsom salts to kind of make him feel better. On the 11th of January, 1923, William told Daisy that the Epsom salts that she kept giving him was making him actually feel worse. So Daisy was obviously feeling quite stressed by this, so she called the doctor. And the doctor that she called gave William bromide. And apparently bromide back in the day was used for muscle spasms and stuff like that. But apparently after William took this bromide, he got even worse and was bending over in pain, convulsing and vomiting everywhere. And so Daisy panicked and she called the neighbors. And when the neighbors got there, they panicked even more. So they called the doctor. And when the doctor arrived, William was foaming at the mouth and he was completely purple in the face. And before the doctor could even examine William, he passed away. And this last doctor that Daisy called was a lot more suspicious of what Daisy was kind of doing. And he refused to sign the death certificate for William because this doctor believed that the signs that William was showing was actually poison. And he believed that the symptoms that William was showing, the way he was turning purple and he wasn't breathing, as well as his convulsions and vomiting, was a symptom of a poison called strychnine, which back in the day was used in very tiny doses for medical purposes. But Daisy was not looked at any further because the autopsy came back for William, and they said that he passed away from chronic kidney disease and bleeding on the brain. So William Carl was buried along with any of his secrets. Now, when William passed away, Daisy was given a very, very large sum of money for William's life insurance, which would have easily meant that Daisy would have been a millionaire in today's standards already. So she was very wealthy back then. But Rhodes and Daisy stayed in the house that William owned for another 3 years. But during Rhodes's teenage years, Daisy met another man called Robert Sproat, and he was also a plumber. He was 10 years older than Daisy. And just after months of meeting, they were married. And disturbingly, they actually got married on the anniversary of William's death. And according to witnesses, Daisy and Robert got on very well as well, except Robert and Rhodes did not like each other. Then after 2 years of Daisy and Robert being married, Robert started to get ill and convulsing. And Robert had a brother, and his brother heard about how ill Robert was getting, so he came over to see him on his deathbed when he was at his worst. And weirdly enough, while Robert's brother was kind of grieving at the state that his brother was in, Daisy kept pushing Robert's brother to convince Robert to make Daisy the beneficiary of Robert's life insurance policy. And I'm not sure why Robert never put Daisy on his life insurance policy when they first got married. Maybe it was because he heard rumors or he just never got around to it. But eventually Robert did put Daisy on his life insurance policy, and then miraculously he got better. But then within months of Robert getting better, he then fell ill again. And this happened at the time when Daisy gave Robert a beer that she poured, and then after he drank the beer, he started convulsing and vomiting again, and sadly did end up passing away. So when Robert passed away, he left Daisy £4,560, which was a lot of money back then and is a lot of money right now. And weirdly enough, both Robert and William were buried side by side. So Daisy spent the rest of her time now just spoiling herself and Rhodes. But she clearly had a thing for men in uniform, and she met another plumber. And she said she fell madly in love with this man, and his name was Sidney de Melker. And Sidney had lost his wife, and he had a daughter that was a similar age to Rhodes at the time. And Sidney was said to be very kind, and he was also very kind to Rhodes, but Rhodes still didn't like Sidney at all. He wanted to be the man of the house, clearly. Sidney and Daisy did end up getting married. And I'm not sure if you are waiting for me to tell you that Sidney eventually started convulsing and getting ill. No, it was not him that was convulsing and getting ill. So Rhodes was very excited to turn 21 because he believed when he was 21 that he would inherit his father's estate and the money that he had left him. And at the time that Sidney and Daisy got married, Rhodes was about 19 years old. But in the meantime, before he could inherit his millions, he worked small jobs as just repairing cars and stuff like on the side. And one day he went to work as normal, and his mom packed him a sandwich and a flask full of coffee. And on the lunch break, Rhodes shared his coffee with one of his co-workers, and as soon as they drank the coffee, they both started feeling really, really ill and vomiting. But once they vomited, they felt a lot better. And I don't know if Daisy thought that maybe she mixed up the amount, but she clearly didn't mess up the next time. But a few weeks later, Rhodes was bent over in extreme pain, and he was on his deathbed, of course with his mother by his side. And sadly, he ended up passing away. And these doctors, I don't know if malaria was the in thing, but this doctor said that he passed away from malaria when he went to Swaziland to work just a couple months before. So by this point, I'm definitely assuming that Daisy had something to do with these suspicious deaths by now. I think that she may have murdered Rhodes because she felt that maybe the older that he was getting, he may have gotten more suspicious and maybe eventually put two and two together. Because remember, Rhodes had seen his father pass away, his 4 siblings and a stepfather pass away in all very, very similar circumstances. And sadly for Daisy, Rhodes was not the man that she should have been worried about for spilling the beans. Now remember Robert Sproat, which was Daisy's second husband? Well, Robert's brother, who was also named William, he was quite traumatized how his brother had passed away, and he vowed that he would keep an eye on Daisy and what she was doing because he had heard now about Rhodes's death. And he heard how similar in circumstance they had died. And because he heard about Rhodes and kind of put 2 and 2 together, he then went to the police and they kind of figured, okay, you're kind of onto something, let's have a look at Daisy. So the police exhumed all of the bodies that Daisy had been in contact with. So William, Robert, and Rhodes were all exhumed. Weirdly enough, Rhodes's body was in pristine condition. And this is said to be a kind of symptom or a condition of what happens when there's a lot of arsenic in the body, because arsenic preserves the body very well. So when the police got the medical records back, they did prove that Rhodes had arsenic in his system, and William and Robert had strychnine in their systems. And remember, Rhodes shared his coffee with his colleague that one day who got sick. So they tested the blood of his colleague as well, and they found arsenic in his system too. So Daisy was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder, and Daisy's trial started in 1932. So remember, Daisy was the first female serial killer recorded in South African history, and because of this, everybody wanted to see her. They were actually charging so that you could sit in the courthouse just to hear what happened to the mysterious and infamous Daisy. And during the trial, they could not find enough evidence to link Daisy to actually killing Robert and William with strychnine. But in Rhodes' case, there was a pharmacist who came forward and said that he recognized Daisy because she came into the pharmacy asking for arsenic, because she said that she had a cat who was very, very ill and she kind of wanted to help him along. I'm glad that we came a long way in putting our own animals down. But this was kind of the nail in the coffin for Daisy, because the pharmacist, like I said, recognized her buying the material that killed Rhodes. And Daisy was sentenced to hanging, and Daisy was hanged on December 8th, 1932. Sydney, her husband, the only one that survived, actually didn't agree that Daisy was ever guilty, and he professed her innocence until he died 20 years later. And just as a side note, just because Daisy was the first registered or documented serial killer in South Africa, she was actually not the first hanged female in South Africa. The first female to actually be hanged in South Africa was Emily Chenier, and she was executed because Emily and her lover ended up killing Emily's husband, and that was in 1903. And the second woman hanged in South Africa was Maria Robbie, and she was also hanged because her and her lover were found guilty of killing her husband. That was in the 1920s. So that meant that Daisy was the third woman to be hanged in South Africa. So all that aside, do you think that Daisy was actually guilty of killing her 4 children? Or do you think that that was just unfortunate circumstances? And also with her first fiance, was it just really bad luck? Or was she really a child killer and a husband killer? So I don't know if she was just so in love with her first fiance that she kind of never ever felt the same kind of love for anybody else. And after her first husband and all of her children passed away, she was just like, that's it, and she just snapped. But I don't know. Let me know what you think down below, and I hope that you enjoyed this. Please stay safe, and I will see you again next week. Bye.